I still remember the sound of the clock ticking on the wall that evening. It was December in Ohio, and the air outside carried the bite of winter sharp and unforgiving. Inside the Caldwell house, the tension was thicker than the smoke that sometimes lingered from the fireplace. My hands trembled in my lap as I stared at my father, Richard Caldwell, a man whose presence filled every corner of the room even when he said nothing. He sat at the head of the table, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on the newspaper in front of him. My mother, Margaret, moved nervously between the stove and the table, setting down plates, as if arranging them just right would keep the storm away. My older sister Sophia sat across from me, her hair sleek, her law textbooks stacked neatly beside her plate, her mouth already curled into that familiar smirk that told me she was ready to enjoy whatever spectacle might unfold. I was 20 years old enough, I thought, to be respected for the choices I made. But in this house, age never mattered. In this house, only obedience and appearances mattered. I had rehearsed the words 100 times in my head. I had promised myself I would not cry. I had promised myself I would speak with calm conviction. But when the words finally left my lips, my voice cracked. "Dad," I whispered, "I need to tell you something." Richard lowered his paper slowly, his eyes narrowing at me as if I had just interrupted a presidential address. Margaret froze with a spoon in her hand, mashed potatoes sliding back into the bowl. Sophia leaned forward, resting her chin in her palm, eager for the show. "I am pregnant." The silence after those words was brutal. It stretched across the table and strangled the air out of the room. For a brief second, I thought maybe my father would simply stare and say nothing, that perhaps though his anger would be certain, it would remain contained. But then his chair screeched against the hardwood floor as he pushed it back. "You what?" His voice was not just a question, it was a thunderclap. I swallowed hard. Pregnant. I am going to have a child. The newspaper that had been in his hands a moment earlier hit the table with a slap that made me jump. He was on his feet now, towering over me, his face red, the veins in his neck rising like ropes. "You disgraced this family. You dare to bring shame under this roof." His words were spat more than spoken. Mom tried to reach for his arm. "Richard, please, we can talk," but he shoved her hand away. "Talk? Nothing to talk about." His palm came down fast. The crack of it echoed through the room as it collided with my cheek. My head snapped to the side, my vision blurred with sudden tears I had sworn not to shed. The sting burned across my skin, but worse than the pain was the message in the strike. I was no longer his daughter. Sophia let out a short laugh. Typical Emma, always ruining things, always dragging us down. I wanted to scream at her, but the weight of my father's glare pinned me to the chair. "Get out," he ordered. His voice was low but lethal, the kind of tone that meant the decision was final. "Dad, please," I begged, my hand instinctively covering my stomach, the tiny life inside me no bigger than a secret yet. "I need your help. I am still your daughter." "Not anymore," he growled. "You made your bed, now lie in it. Get out of my house." Mom's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. She pressed a napkin to her mouth and stared down at the tablecloth as if silence could erase what was happening. Sophia leaned back, arms crossed, smug satisfaction radiating from her. I stood slowly, my legs trembling. The room blurred as I grabbed my coat from the back of the chair. My father did not move. His eyes stayed locked on me like I was a stain he needed scrubbed out of existence. With shaking hands, I picked up the small canvas bag I had prepared weeks earlier in secret. Some part of me must have known this day would come. Inside were 2 sweaters, a pair of jeans, and a worn notebook where I had scribbled dreams that now felt childish. The cold rushed at me as I stepped outside. The door slammed behind me with a finality that cut through the night. Snowflakes clung to my hair, melted on my lashes. My cheek still burned from the slap, but it was nothing compared to the ache in my chest. I stood there on the porch, clutching the strap of my bag, staring down the dark street. My breath fogged in the bitter air. For the first time in my life, I had no home, no family, no plan. Just the knowledge that inside me a new life waited, depending entirely on me. The sting of rejection seared deeper than the winter chill. My father's words repeated in my head, sharp and unrelenting. "You disgraced this family. Get out." So I did. I stepped off that porch into the night, into the snow, into the unknown. And though I did not know it then, that moment was not the end of my story. It was the beginning. Before that night, when the door slammed behind me and the snow swallowed me whole, my life had been a slow build of small humiliations and unspoken rivalries. I was born the second daughter of Richard and Margaret Caldwell in Dayton, Ohio, in a modest two-story house that was anything but modest in my father's mind. He carried himself like a man of stature, the kind of man whose family name must be polished to shine at every Sunday service. Sophia, my older sister, was always the shining jewel of his creation. She was praised for her grades, celebrated for her charm, photographed at every dance and competition. Her room sparkled with trophies and certificates, and when guests came to visit, Richard would lead them straight to her wall of achievements as if it were his personal shrine. My room was down the hall, smaller plain, decorated with posters I had bought myself from discount bins. I was the girl who read quietly in corners, who dreamed of becoming something in medicine, who helped Mom with dishes while Sophia rehearsed debate speeches. The difference in treatment was not subtle. When Sophia announced she wanted to go to law school, my father nearly burst with pride. He called her our future attorney, introduced her to his colleagues, and promised to pay for every dollar of her tuition. When I said I wanted to study pharmacology, he waved his hand dismissively. "Sophia will argue in front of judges. You will hand out pills at a pharmacy. Do not compare the two." That sting never left me, even as I carried on with my classes, working part-time at the campus library just to cover books and fees. Ethan Morales entered my life like a warm gust of wind during my sophomore year at the local community college. He was a former high school soccer star, still carrying that boyish grin that made girls blush. To me, though, he felt like something more. Someone who noticed me when I was invisible in my own family. He would walk me home after class, sit with me in the park, talk about leaving Dayton for bigger things. Ethan spoke of starting a small business, maybe moving to Florida or California, where the sun never seemed to quit. I believed him. At 20 years old, you cling to those kinds of promises because they sound like escape, like freedom from the walls that suffocate you. But promises are fragile things. By the time I missed my second period and felt the unease in my stomach every morning, Ethan was already slipping away. His texts slowed, then stopped. He always had an excuse practice with old teammates, long shifts at the warehouse, needing time to figure things out. When I told him I was pregnant, he froze, stared at me with wide eyes, then muttered something about needing space. The space became permanent. He was gone within weeks. Looking back, I should not have been surprised. Ethan had never stood up to anyone in his life. Expecting him to stand beside me in the storm was foolish. Still, the silence he left behind was deafening. I tried to hold it together to focus on school, but nausea and fatigue pulled me under. I spent nights hunched over textbooks, hands pressed to my belly, whispering to a life that was only beginning. I told myself I could do this. I told myself love would be enough even if I was alone. My father, of course, noticed the changes. Richard missed nothing when it came to appearances. My baggy sweatshirts did not fool him. He would glare across the dinner table, suspicion curdling in his eyes. Sophia whispered behind her hand, smirking. My mother fussed over me in quiet ways, sliding extra food onto my plate, placing folded laundry on my bed without a word, but she never dared confront me. Silence was her weapon and her shield. I wanted to confess sooner. I wanted to stand tall and declare that though I had stumbled, I would carry this child with dignity. But in that house, dignity was defined by Richard, and mercy was not in his vocabulary. The night I finally spoke, it was not courage that pushed me. It was exhaustion. I was tired of hiding, tired of shrinking. I wanted foolishly to believe my parents might soften. Instead, my confession lit the fuse that had been waiting for years. Richard's slap was not just about my pregnancy. It was about every resentment he had ever harbored that his second daughter was not a reflection of his pride. It was about his obsession with the family name, about the gossip he feared would ripple through the pews at church. Margaret's silence was not just about fear. It was about decades of yielding, of convincing herself that survival meant obedience. Sophia's laughter was not just cruelty. It was triumph, the satisfaction of the golden child watching the scapegoat finally burn. I carried all of this in me as I stepped into the snow. My childhood memories were not filled with bedtime stories or warm embraces. They were filled with the sound of my father's boots on hardwood, with the tight line of my mother's mouth, with the endless comparison to Sophia. Yet even in those shadows, I had held on to one small flame, the belief that I could build a different life, one defined not by their approval, but by my own strength. That flame flickered dangerously low the night I was cast out, but it did not die. In the weeks that followed, as I dragged myself from one bus stop to another, clutching my canvas bag and wondering where I might sleep, I thought about all the times I had been told I was less than all the times I had been reminded of my failures. Those words carved scars into me, yes, but they also hardened something inside. They gave me a stubbornness I would soon need more than ever. For years, Sophia had been the crown jewel, and I the shadow. But shadows have a way of surviving what jewels cannot. That thought lingered as I stepped into the unknown, carrying both my child and the weight of a past I refused to let define me forever. The confrontation that ended my life as I knew it began with a simple dinner. The Caldwell table was always a stage for my father's authority. Richard sat at the head, his shoulders squared like a general reviewing troops. Margaret hovered at his side, fussing with serving spoons, pretending everything was fine as long as the silverware shone. Sophia occupied her spot across from me, her law books stacked like a fortress beside her plate, the curve of her smile sharp enough to cut. I remember the meatloaf steaming in the middle, the smell of gravy thick in the air, the ticking of the kitchen clock drilling into my skull as I tried to gather the courage to speak. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind so many times. I imagined Dad leaning back in shock, but eventually softening Mom crying, but then pulling me into her arms, Sophia rolling her eyes, but ultimately moving on. None of that happened. Instead, when I finally said the words, "I am pregnant," the room collapsed into chaos. My father's face turned a shade of crimson I had only ever seen during his angriest outbursts. He slammed his fist on the table so hard the glasses rattled. "Pregnant!" His voice came out like thunder. "You dare to disgrace me, disgrace this family. The church will hear, the neighbors will talk. Do you want people to point at us in the grocery store, Emma Caldwell, the shame of Dayton?" His words poured out like venom. My mother's fork clattered against her plate, her eyes wide with panic, but she said nothing. Sophia smirked, leaning back in her chair, her voice dripping with disdain. "Typical Emma. Can't do anything right. Always dragging us down." I wanted to scream at her, but my father's voice drowned everything else. "Who is the father?" he demanded, looming over me like a judge ready to hand down a sentence. I tried to steady my voice to keep it from breaking. "He is gone. He left when he found out." "But I can handle this, I swear." "Handle this?" My father's laugh was cruel sharp. "You think you can raise a child. You cannot even manage your own life. You will not raise a child under my roof. Not one born of shame." His words sliced through me. "Dad, please," I begged, my hands instinctively wrapping around my stomach as though I could shield the small life inside from his rage. "I need you. I need this family. You still have me. I am still your daughter." He leaned down his face inches from mine, his breath hot with fury. "Not anymore. You made your bed. Now lie in it. Get out of my house." My knees trembled. My mother whispered his name, Richard, but her voice was weak, drowned out by his. My sister's laugh filled the silence. "This is just so, Emma. Ruining dinners, ruining reputations. You always were a mistake." My tears finally broke free, streaming hot across my face. I pushed my chair back and stood, the legs scraping the floor. My father's glare followed me, burning into the back of my skull as I grabbed my coat from the hook by the door. My canvas bag waited upstairs, but I had packed it earlier that week, a secret born out of dread. Something in me had known this moment was inevitable. I raced up the stairs, ignoring the creaks and groans of the old wood beneath my feet, yanked the bag from under my bed and stuffed it with clothes, notebooks, and a framed photo I almost hurled against the wall. Ethan's arm around me, the county fair glowing behind us. A reminder of trust betrayed, but still I slipped it into the side pocket. When I came back down, the dining room was a battlefield. The meatloaf sat congealing, the gravy hardened at the edges of the dish. My mother stood frozen at the table, her face blotchy with tears she would not shed aloud. My father's chair sat empty. He had stormed into the garage, the door slammed so hard the walls still shook. Sophia twirled her fork between her fingers, looking smug as though she had just won a case. I stood in the doorway, my duffel biting into my shoulder, my throat raw. "I am leaving." My voice was hoarse but steady. My mother finally lifted her head. Her eyes were red, her voice desperate. "Emma, wait. Just think. Where will you even go? Does it matter I shot back my pain spilling out?" "You heard him. I am not welcome here." Margaret stepped forward, her hands reaching but not quite touching. "We are upset, that is all. We need time. Running off is not the answer." Upset, I snapped. "You called me a disgrace. He told me to get out." "What am I supposed to do? Pretend none of that happened." Her mouth opened, then closed. She gripped the edge of the table as if it could hold her upright. "We just need time," she whispered again, almost to herself. "Time's up," I said, turning before my resolve cracked. I pulled my coat tighter, opened the front door, and stepped out into the biting winter night. The cold slapped me harder than my father's hand had sharp and merciless. Snowflakes swirled under the yellow glow of the streetlights, catching in my hair and melting down my cheeks until I could not tell where the snow ended and my tears began. My mother's voice echoed faintly behind me, muffled by the walls, but she did not come outside. No one did. I walked down the steps and into the street, my breath fogging in the air, each step crunching against the frozen ground. I did not know where I was going. I only knew that I could not go back. Behind me, the Caldwell house glowed warmly, its windows lit with a false promise of comfort. Inside, there was food heat shelter, but none of it belonged to me anymore. My father had made sure of that. My mother had let it happen. My sister had enjoyed it. I pulled my bag closer and kept walking, the snow biting through my sneakers, the night swallowing me whole. That was the confrontation. It was not just about my pregnancy. It was about years of being erased, of being treated as less, of being told my worth was measured against Sophia's perfection. It was about a father who valued reputation over love, a mother who valued silence over protection, and a sister who valued victory over compassion. Their words and actions that night carved a scar deeper than the slap on my cheek. They told me I did not belong. And so I left. The confrontation ended not with reconciliation, not with compromise, but with exile. An exile that forced me into the arms of survival and into the only refuge I had left. The thought of my grandmother Clara 2 hours away, who had once told me family is not blood, family is who stays. At that moment, shivering in the snow, clutching my unborn child, I decided to find her. The bus ride to Dayton felt longer than it was. My duffel sat heavy on my lap, my hands clutching the straps so tight my knuckles turned white. The bus windows were fogged from the heat inside, meeting the cold air outside, and every time the glass cleared for a second, I caught glimpses of frozen fields, dark barns, and lonely roads stretching into the night. My cheek still burned faintly from the slap, but the real pain was deeper, an ache in my chest that no scarf or coat could protect. I had nowhere else to go but to my grandmother, Clara Jensen. She was my mother's mother, a woman who had lived her whole life in Dayton in a little brick house with a sagging porch. My father never liked her. He called her too soft, as if kindness were a flaw. But for me, she had always been a lifeline. A gentle voice at family gatherings, a secret ally who would slip me cookies when Dad said no, or whisper, "You're stronger than you think, Emma," when Sophia overshadowed me. I had not seen her in months, but her words were tucked away in my memory, like a compass. When the bus finally pulled into Dayton's small station, the clock outside read nearly midnight. The streets were quiet, the lamps buzzing with halos of frost. I dragged myself the 3 blocks to her street, my sneakers slipping on patches of ice. The house came into view, the porch light glowing dim but steady, the old rose bushes along the path dusted in snow. Before I could even knock, the door creaked open, and there she stood in her faded quilted robe, her silver hair pulled into a loose bun, her sharp gray eyes scanning me from head to toe. She did not ask questions. She just stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me. Her hug was firm, steady, the kind of embrace that told me without words I was no longer alone. "Come on in, dear," she said in her rough but warm voice. "There's always a place for you here." I stepped inside, and the smell of old wood chamomile tea and faint cinnamon hit me like a wave. The house was small and cluttered with decades of life. A plaid couch sagged under the weight of its spring's shelves lined with chipped teacups caught the dim lamplight, and the low hum of a jazz station drifted from the radio in the corner. I sank onto the couch, clutching my duffel like a lifeline, while Clara shuffled into the kitchen. Minutes later, she returned with 2 mugs of tea and a plate of sandwiches. "Eat," she ordered softly, setting them down. "You'll think clearer with food in your belly." I tried to eat, but halfway through the first bite, the dam broke. I set the sandwich down my hands, trembling, my tears spilling freely. "Grandma," I choked out. "I messed up. Mom and Dad kicked me out. They said I disgraced them. They told me I am not their daughter anymore. And I am pregnant." The words hung heavy in the small room. Clara took a long, slow sip of her tea before setting the mug aside. She leaned forward, her weathered hand resting firm on my shoulder. "Oh, child," she said, her voice low and steady. "People say all sorts of cruel things when they're scared or ashamed. But listen to me. A baby is no disgrace. It is a blessing, even when it is hard, especially when it is hard." My chest heaved with sobs. "They do not see it that way. Dad told me to get out. He meant it. And Ethan, he is gone. He does not even know. How am I supposed to do this alone?" Clara's eyes sharpened, her grip tightening on my shoulder. "You are not alone. You have me. I raised your mother through tougher times than this, and I will help you raise this child. We will manage one step at a time." "But what if I cannot?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "What if I am not strong enough?" Clara chuckled softly, a raspy sound like gravel smoothed by water. "Strong enough. You walked out of that house tonight with nothing but courage and a bag on your back. That is more guts than most folks twice your age. You will figure it out. We both will. Now finish that sandwich before it goes cold." I smiled weakly through my tears, picked up the bread, and took another bite. For the first time since the nightmare began, the tightness in my chest eased a little. Within the walls of Clara's little brick house, the sting of rejection and the bite of winter started to thaw. She had not just opened her door. She had given me a lifeline, a chance to rebuild a place where I was not a disgrace, but a daughter once more. That night, as I curled up on the plaid couch under one of Clara's old quilts, the radio humming softly in the background, I pressed my hand against my stomach. My child shifted inside me, faint but real, and for the first time I whispered a promise into the dark. "We will survive. We will build something new." The weeks after I moved in with Grandma Clara were a blur of exhaustion and fear, laced with a stubborn determination that I had never felt before. Her little brick house on the edge of Dayton became the fragile cocoon where I tried to piece myself back together. Every morning I woke to the smell of chamomile tea or toast from the kitchen. And though the warmth was comforting, the reality of my situation pressed hard on my chest. I was 20 years old, pregnant with no money, no partner, and parents who had turned me out into the cold. Clara never made me feel like a burden, but I knew her pension stretched thin, and the thought of depending entirely on her gnawed at me. So I did what I had to do. I found work at a cafe downtown, the kind of place where the air was always thick with the smell of burnt coffee and old muffins. The pay was minimum wage $7.25 an hour, but it was something. My days were long and my feet ached from standing behind the counter refilling cups for grumpy regulars, wiping tables sticky with sugar packets and spilled cream. My belly grew little by little under my apron, and some days the nausea hit so hard I had to excuse myself to the bathroom, gripping the sink until the dizziness passed. The manager, a middle-aged woman named Carol with a smoker's laugh, sometimes looked at me like I was trouble waiting to happen, but she never fired me. Maybe she saw a little of herself in me. Maybe she just needed the extra hands. Either way, I worked every shift I could get, pocketing tips and crumpled bills and change that I tucked into an old coffee tin back at Clara's house. With a black marker, I scrawled Daniel's college fund across the front. I did not even know yet if my baby would be a boy or girl, but somehow the name Daniel came to me one night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, whispering to the tiny life inside me. "Daniel," I said softly, "we are going to make it." Clara became my anchor. She did the laundry, cooked meals, rubbed my back when I came home from the cafe, too tired to move. At night, we sat on her sagging couch watching old reruns on the small television, her knitting needles clicking, while I sipped tea and tried not to drown in fear. Sometimes she would tell me stories about raising my mother, about how Richard had been a difficult child, even then, how he always wanted control. It helped to know she saw him for what he was. It made me feel less crazy for the rage that burned in me whenever I thought of his face. The months dragged by, heavy with winter storms and endless shifts at the cafe. My body changed in ways that frightened me. My ankles swelled, my back ached, and some mornings I could barely button my uniform. Customers noticed eventually, their eyes flicking to my belly, their whispers not as quiet as they thought. I swallowed the humiliation because I had no choice. Pride would not feed my child. When the time finally came, it was a hot August morning. I was rinsing dishes in Clara's kitchen when a sharp pain sliced through me, dropping me to my knees. My water broke in a flood across the linoleum. Clara rushed to my side, her robe flapping her face pale but steady. "Let's go, girl," she said, grabbing her keys. "Time to meet this little one." At the hospital, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while the contractions racked my body. Hours blurred together in a haze of pain and sweat. Clara never left my side. She wiped my forehead with a cool cloth, held my hand through every scream, and whispered, "You are stronger than you know." Finally, after what felt like forever, a cry pierced the air. The nurse placed a tiny squirming bundle on my chest. He had a shock of dark hair and lungs that filled the room. "My son, Daniel." Tears streamed down my face as I whispered, "You are my joy, my secret, my reason." Clara leaned over her eyes, wet her smile wide. "Look at that fighter," she said, proud as ever. "You did good, Emma. Real good." The months after Daniel's birth were both the hardest and the most beautiful of my life. Nights were endless, broken by his cries, my body still aching from delivery. I returned to the cafe after a few weeks, leaving Daniel with Clara. My heart heavy every time I walked out the door. But bills had to be paid, and diapers and formula were not free. I learned quickly how to stretch $1. I bought secondhand clothes at thrift shops, clipped coupons from the Sunday paper, and packed sandwiches instead of buying lunch. Every extra penny went into that coffee tin under my bed. Daniel grew quickly, his dark hair turning into a soft mop, his eyes wide with curiosity. By the time he was 5, he asked endless questions, tugging at my sleeve in the kitchen. "Why do birds fly? How do clouds stay up there?" His hunger for knowledge was endless. Clara would chuckle, calling him our little professor. Teachers noticed too. Mrs. Larson, his first-grade teacher, told me during a conference, "This boy has a mind for science. He explains things so clearly other kids understand because of him." I smiled with pride, though deep inside I felt a pang of fear. Could I ever give him the future he deserved? I was still just a waitress in a cafe scraping by. But I promised myself I would. I picked up online classes at night, studying nursing while Daniel slept. It was brutal balancing shifts at the cafe coursework and motherhood, but every time I felt like giving up, I looked at him. He deserved more. He deserved everything. Clara kept us afloat in ways that went beyond food and shelter. She gave us love. On evenings when I came home too exhausted to think she would be rocking Daniel in her chair humming old songs. He clung to her like another mother, and I knew we would not have survived without her. Yet even with her strength, there were days when the weight of survival crushed me. Once, when Daniel was 3, I came home to find the power shut off the house dark and cold. I collapsed on the couch, sobbing, while Clara lit candles and whispered, "We will manage." And we did. I scraped together enough to pay the bill the next morning. There were moments when shame tried to consume me, moments when I thought of Richard and Margaret sitting comfortably in their home while I worked myself to the bone. They had erased me, but I refused to let them erase my son. Every struggle, every sacrifice was building something stronger than the life they had cast me out of. Daniel's laughter, Clara's steady hand, the quiet strength I found in myself, those were the bricks of our new foundation. Survival was ugly. It was unglamorous, relentless, often thankless. But it was ours. And as Daniel grew, as his questions multiplied, as the coffee tin filled slowly with change and crumpled bills, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, we were not just surviving. We were beginning to live. As the years passed, I began to realize that survival was no longer enough. When Daniel turned 6 and started school full-time, I finally had a few hours in the day that were mine. Clara urged me to use them for rest, but deep inside I knew that rest would not build a future. I enrolled in an online nursing program through the community college, balancing coursework between late-night feedings and early morning shifts at the cafe. The laptop I used was second-hand, the Wi-Fi slow, and the textbooks expensive, but I pressed on. Each exam I passed felt like reclaiming a piece of the self I had been told did not matter. Richard's voice haunted me sometimes, the echo of, "You cannot handle this. You will not raise a child under my roof." Every A on a quiz, every late-night essay, every clinical hour I completed was my answer back to him. I could handle this. I would handle it. Daniel became my little cheerleader. He would curl up beside me on the couch, his small hand resting on my arm, while I typed away. "What are you doing, Mom?" he asked, once his eyes bright. "Studying," I told him. "Why?" "Because I want to take care of people. Because I want to show you that we can do more than just get by." He grinned, gap-toothed, and announced proudly, "Then I will take care of people too. Maybe I will be a doctor." The words stuck with me. Even at that age, Daniel had a mind that never stopped turning. He dismantled flashlights and rebuilt them with wires that somehow worked better than before. He filled notebooks with drawings of bugs and planets, asking questions that left me scrambling for answers. Clara would watch him with a proud smile, calling him a little scientist. Teachers noticed, too. In 3rd grade, Mrs. Larson told me during a conference that Daniel had explained photosynthesis to the class in a way no one else could. "He has a gift," she said. "Do not let it go to waste." Her words both lifted me and weighed me down. I wanted more than anything to give him every chance, but the reality of bills and groceries and tuition loomed like a wall. Still, I kept saving. The coffee tin under my bed grew heavier each month, even if only by pennies and nickels. I told myself one day that tin would turn into opportunity. The turning point came when I finally finished my nursing program. I remember walking across the small stage at the community center, my certificate in hand, Daniel and Clara clapping wildly in the audience. It was not a fancy ceremony, but to me, it was a triumph. I had done it despite every obstacle, every voice telling me I could not. Soon after, I landed a job at the hospital in Dayton, working long shifts, but earning more than I ever had. The first time I brought home a real paycheck, I cried in the kitchen holding the stub in my hands while Clara hugged me and said, "See, Emma, you were always strong enough." With nursing came confidence. For the first time, I felt like I was shaping my own life, not just reacting to what had been forced on me. I walked into rooms with purpose, introduced myself to patients with a steady voice, learned from doctors and specialists who treated me as a peer. The Emma who had been erased at that dining table years earlier was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew her worth. Daniel watched it all. He saw me leave in scrubs before dawn, saw me return bone-tired but still smiling, saw the pride in Clara's eyes when I told her stories from the hospital. One evening, he came running into the kitchen holding a science fair ribbon, his eyes shining. "I won, Mom. I built the best project. It was about circuits. They said I explained it better than anyone." I knelt down and hugged him tight, my chest swelling with pride. "You can be anything you want, Daniel," I whispered. "Anything." He looked at me with those determined hazel eyes and said, "Then I will be a surgeon. Surgeons save lives." "Just like you, Mom, but more." Clara chuckled from her chair, her knitting needles pausing. "Sounds like he means it, Emma. Sounds like he is serious." And he was. From that day forward, Daniel poured himself into school, devouring books on anatomy, volunteering at science clubs, shadowing doctors whenever he could. He was relentless in his pursuit, and every time I watched him, I felt both awe and fear. Awe because his determination reminded me of the fire I had fought to build. Fear because I knew the world would not make it easy for him either. Yet with every step he took, I stood beside him. I reminded him of the nights I studied by lamplight, of the days I scrubbed tables at the cafe. I told him success was not handed to anyone, least of all to us, but that did not mean it was impossible. He listened. He believed. He carried that belief into every test, every application, every challenge. And somewhere along the way, I realized that his journey was also mine. His growth mirrored my own, and together we had turned struggle into strength. Self-assertion was no longer just about proving Richard wrong. It was about showing Daniel that our story did not end with rejection. It was about building a new legacy, one that began not with shame, but with resilience. I was no longer the girl trembling at the dinner table. I was a nurse, a mother, a woman who had carved her place in the world. And Daniel was no longer the secret I had whispered to in the dark. He was a young man standing tall, ready to claim a future that once seemed unreachable. In that shared journey, we both found ourselves. I never thought love would find me again. After Ethan abandoned me, the idea of trusting a man felt like a wound that would never close. My life was about Daniel, about work, about keeping the promises I had whispered to him on sleepless nights. Romance was a luxury for women who did not carry scars like mine. But life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. I met Jacob Rivera at the hospital. He was not a doctor or a patient. He was a civil engineer contracted to oversee a renovation project on one of the wings. I noticed him first in the cafeteria line, tall with dark hair and a quiet confidence that drew people in without effort. He carried a hard hat tucked under his arm and spoke to the cashier with a politeness that made her blush. I kept my eyes down, telling myself I had no room in my world for distraction, but the universe ignored me. Weeks later, he appeared in my ward reviewing blueprints with a group of contractors. He caught me watching him from the nurse's station and offered a small smile. Most men would have tried a line or a joke. Jacob simply nodded in respect and went back to his work. That small gesture stayed with me longer than it should have. Our paths crossed more often as the project progressed. He would stop by for updates on patient flow and safety regulations, and somehow our conversations stretched beyond logistics. We talked about Dayton winters, about the best tacos in town, about books that had changed our lives. He asked about Daniel once, not in the careless way men sometimes do, but with genuine interest. When I told him about my son's fascination with science, Jacob's face lit up. "That kid sounds brilliant," he said. "You must be proud." Something in his tone told me he meant it, and I found myself smiling in a way I had not in years. Still, trust was slow. When he asked if I would like to have coffee after my shift, my instinct was to say no. My walls were high-built brick by brick from betrayal and survival, but Clara nudged me gently. "Do not shut the door before you know what is behind it," she said one evening while folding laundry. So I said yes. We met at a small cafe downtown on a rainy Thursday. I arrived in Scrub's hair pulled back, exhaustion etched into my face. Jacob looked up from his cup of tea, and his expression softened, not with pity, but with warmth. We talked for hours as the rain tapped against the windows. He told me about growing up in a big family in Texas, about moving to Ohio for work, about his love for building things that lasted. I told him pieces of my story carefully, waiting for the flicker of judgment that never came. When I confessed that Daniel's father had disappeared, Jacob only nodded. His loss, he said simply. "You and your boy deserve better." That night, I went home unsettled, not because I doubted him, but because I doubted myself. Could I risk letting someone in again? Could I trust that this would not end in the same heartbreak? For weeks, I wrestled with it, but Jacob was patient. He did not push. He showed up with small kindnesses like a bouquet of daisies left at the nurse's desk or a set of building blocks for Daniel. One Saturday afternoon, he came to Clara's house to fix a broken step on the porch. Daniel hovered nearby, asking a million questions about hammers and nails, and Jacob answered everyone with patience. By the time the step was sturdy again, Daniel was laughing, his guard lowered in a way I had not seen with any other man. Watching them together made something shift in me. Jacob was not trying to replace anyone. He was simply showing up steady and real. Our relationship grew slowly, deliberately. Dinners at the diner, walks through the park evenings, helping Daniel with school projects. I tested him with my silences, my doubts, my scars. He never flinched. He told me once, "Emma, I am not here to rescue you. You already rescued yourself. I just want to stand beside you." Those words mattered more than flowers or promises. Years of pain had taught me to measure love not in declarations but in consistency. Jacob proved himself in the ways that counted, the way he respected Clara, the way he encouraged Daniel, the way he looked at me as if my past was not baggage but strength. When he finally asked me to marry him, it was not with a grand gesture, but on a quiet evening at Clara's kitchen table. He slid a simple ring across the wood and said, "I want to build a life with you, with Daniel, with all of it." Tears blurred my vision as I nodded. Our wedding was small, just family and a few close friends. Richard and Margaret did not attend. Sophia did not send a card. But as I stood in that modest church, Daniel holding Jacob's hand, Clara beaming in the front row, I realized I did not need them. I had built my own family stronger than anything I had left behind. Love had found me not as a rescue, but as a partner, and for the first time in years, I felt whole. Daniel's journey into medicine did not begin with a grand announcement or a sudden epiphany. It began with the small, relentless way he devoured knowledge, the way his curiosity refused to be quiet. By middle school, he was already staying up late with a flashlight under his blanket, reading science magazines I borrowed from the hospital library. When I scolded him for missing sleep, he grinned and said, "But Mom, I just needed to finish the article about heart transplants." Clara would laugh from her chair, her knitting needles clicking, and tell me he was a boy with a brain too big to contain. At school, his teachers praised him, calling him gifted, though I never let that word make him arrogant. Gifted or not, I reminded him, "You still have to work twice as hard to prove yourself." He listened. He always listened. By high school, he was volunteering at a local clinic on weekends, shadowing nurses and asking doctors questions most adults never thought to ask. I watched him carry himself with a focus and determination that reminded me of my own long nights of study, except he had an intensity all his own. Jacob encouraged him, constantly building desks for him to study at, buying used medical textbooks from thrift shops. Clara would slip him $20 bills with a wink and say, "For your future boy." Every bit of support became fuel for his fire. His high school graduation felt like a victory for all of us. He crossed the stage in a navy cap and gown, the tassel swinging his name announced to cheers. When he held his diploma, I saw not just a boy finishing high school, but the man he was becoming, a man determined to carve his place in the world of medicine. He had applied to several universities, each with strong pre-med programs, and the day the acceptance letter from Ohio State arrived, we all cried in the kitchen. He was the first Caldwell of his generation to go to college, and he was going on his own terms, not as a golden child paraded for reputation, but as a young man who had earned it with every ounce of his grit. College years were grueling. Daniel threw himself into biology, chemistry, physics, spending long nights in labs, calling me at midnight to explain something he had just learned about molecular structures or the nervous system. His professors recognized his passion quickly. One told me during a parents' weekend visit, "Your son is the kind of student who reminds us why we teach. He challenges us. He wants to understand everything." Financially, those years were a mountain to climb. Scholarships helped, and Daniel worked as a tutor, but I still took on extra shifts at the hospital. Jacob took side projects in construction, and even Clara chipped in from her pension. The coffee tin under my bed was replaced by a bank account labeled Daniel's Future, but the feeling was the same. Every dollar was a step toward his dream. By his junior year, he had decided firmly that he wanted to pursue surgery. He loved the idea of using his hands, of working under pressure, of saving lives in the most direct way possible. He called me one night after assisting in a student lab where they dissected a cadaver and whispered, "Mom, it felt like this is what I was made to do." I believed him. He applied for medical schools with the same intensity he had brought to every challenge. The day the acceptance letter from Johns Hopkins arrived, he sat at the kitchen table holding it as if it might vanish. His hands shook, his eyes wide. "Hopkins, Mom," he breathed. "They want me." Clara clapped her hands and cried. Jacob lifted him off the ground in a bear hug, and I just sat there, stunned, tears streaming down my face. My boy from Dayton, the boy they said was born of shame, was going to one of the best medical schools in the country. The years at Hopkins were brutal. Daniel called me after 18-hour study sessions, his voice hoarse but steady. He described anatomy labs, clinical rotations, endless exams. He told me about patients he observed, about the first time he assisted in suturing, about the moment he held a human heart during surgery. He carried the weight of exhaustion, but he never wavered. Every challenge seemed to feed him rather than break him. He pushed through 4 years of medical school with the same determination that had carried him from those nights under the blanket with a flashlight. When the day of his graduation came, we all traveled to Baltimore. The hall was packed with families, the air buzzing with pride. Daniel walked across the stage in his black gown, the hood of medicine draped over his shoulders, his name read aloud as Dr. Daniel Caldwell. I stood between Jacob and Clara, sobbing openly, my heart splitting with joy. Clara whispered, "We did it, girl. We really did it." And she was right. This was not just Daniel's victory, it was ours. After graduation came the nerve-wracking process of residency applications known as the match. Daniel filled out forms, ranked hospitals, interviewed with programs across the country. He wanted surgery, and he wanted Hopkins. The wait was agonizing. Then one March morning he opened the email, his eyes scanning quickly before he shouted so loud the neighbors probably heard. Matched. Hopkins. Surgery. He was 25 years old and about to begin the hardest years of his life. But his dream was real. His first days as a surgical resident were long and brutal. He worked shifts that stretched into the night, standing in operating rooms for hours, his scrubs soaked with sweat. He came home with dark circles under his eyes, his voice rasping with fatigue, but there was a light in him that never dimmed. He called me after his first solo assist on an appendectomy and whispered, "Mom, I saved someone today." The pride in his voice filled every corner of me. At Hopkins, he quickly gained respect. Attendings praised his steady hands, his calm under pressure, his relentless curiosity. He studied constantly, slept little, but carried himself with a humility that made patients trust him. Newspapers even picked up his story, the small-town boy who rose to become a young surgeon at Hopkins. One article called him local young doctor saving lives, and when I read those words, I thought back to the night Richard told me I was no longer his daughter. The contrast was almost unbearable. My son, the boy they had erased, had become everything they said he could not be. Daniel's journey was not just his. It was the living proof that the cycle of shame could be broken, that strength could be forged from rejection, that resilience could build a legacy far stronger than reputation. And as I watched him stride through hospital corridors in his white coat, the name Dr. Caldwell embroidered on his chest, I felt a quiet certainty. We had done more than survive. We had triumphed. The article that changed everything arrived on a Sunday morning. Clara was sitting at the kitchen table with her tea when she called out, "Emma, come look at this." I wiped my hands on a dish towel and leaned over her shoulder. There, on the front page of the Dayton Gazette, was a headline that made my heart lurch, "Local Young Doctor Saving Lives at Hopkins." Beneath it was a photograph of Daniel in his white coat, his dark hair neatly combed, his eyes steady as he stood outside the hospital. The article told his story, how he had grown up in Dayton, how he had worked tirelessly to rise from modest beginnings, how he was now a surgical resident at one of the most prestigious hospitals in the country. They praised his dedication, his compassion, his promise as a young surgeon. I read every word with tears blurring the ink. My boy, my Daniel. But I also knew the Gazette reached farther than our kitchen table. It reached into the Caldwell house across town, and sure enough, 2 weeks later, they came. I was in the garden pulling weeds when a car crunched down the gravel driveway. I looked up, shading my eyes, and felt my stomach twist. Richard and Margaret Caldwell stepped out of a silver sedan. Time had not softened them. My father's hair was whiter, his shoulders stooped, but his eyes were the same hard steel. My mother looked smaller somehow, her hands twisting together, her eyes red as if from crying. Emma Margaret called softly, as though 25 years of silence could be bridged with a single word. I froze dirt, clinging to my gloves, my heart pounding. Clara appeared in the doorway, her cane tapping against the frame, her sharp eyes narrowing. "What do you want?" Richard cleared his throat, his voice rougher but still carrying that old authority. "We came to see Daniel. We read about him. He is our grandson. We want to meet him." My breath caught fury rising like a tide. Now! Now, after decades of silence. After the slap that burned on my cheek for years after the words get out that had banished me from their lives. Now they wanted access because the world recognized his brilliance. Clara's voice cut sharp through the air. "You do not get to claim him now, not after what you did to Emma." Richard's jaw tightened. "We made mistakes," he said stiffly. "We were trying to protect our family." "Protect your pride," Clara snapped. "You threw away your daughter." Margaret stepped forward, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Please, Emma, we were wrong. We see that now. We lost you. We lost so many years. But Daniel, he is part of us. We just want a chance." I pulled off my gloves, my hands trembling. My voice came out low, steady, but laced with the rage of 2 decades. "You want to meet Daniel, the boy you tried to erase, the boy I raised alone while you pretended I did not exist. You do not want him. You want the status his name now carries." Margaret sobbed harder, reaching toward me. "That is not true. We love him. We are proud of him." I stepped back. "You do not know him. You never asked about him. You never sent a dime, a letter, a card. Clara raised him more than you ever raised me." Richard's face hardened. "Emma, we are still his grandparents. You cannot keep him from us." Something in me snapped, then the years of silence, the humiliation, the exile. "Watch me," I hissed. That evening, I told Jacob what had happened. He set his jaw and said, "They will not get near him unless you want them to." Daniel was still at the hospital working long shifts, but when he came home for dinner 2 nights later, I sat him down at the kitchen table. I told him everything, every detail of that night when I was 20, every word Richard had spit at me, every silence Margaret had chosen. Daniel listened quietly, his face unreadable, his hands folded on the table. When I finished, the house was silent, but for the ticking of the clock. "Mom," he said finally, "I need to see them." My stomach dropped. "Daniel, no! You do not know them." He reached across the table, taking my hand. "That is exactly why. I need to look them in the eyes. I need to understand." Reluctantly, I agreed to let them come for dinner. If nothing else, I wanted them to hear the truth in front of others where their lies could not hide. Clara supported me, her voice firm. "Let them come. But let the truth come too." The night of the dinner, the house was full. Jacob cooked, Clara set the table, neighbors and a few cousins filled the seats. Daniel came straight from the hospital in his scrubs, his hair damp with sweat, his stethoscope still slung around his neck. When Richard and Margaret walked in, the room went quiet. Richard tried to carry himself with his old authority, but his eyes flicked nervously around the room. Margaret's gaze went straight to Daniel, her face breaking into a sob. "My grandson," she whispered. Daniel stood slowly, his posture straight, his voice calm but cold. "You once erased my mother. She raised me alone. My family is right here." The room held its breath. Richard cleared his throat, his voice faltering. "We regret what we did. We want to make amends. We want to know you." Daniel's eyes did not soften. "You want to know me now because I wear a white coat. But where were you when my mother was 17, carrying me in the dead of winter, working herself to the bone? Where were you when she cried herself to sleep on a couch in my great-grandmother's house?" His words cut like a scalpel. Margaret sobbed openly, but Richard tried to speak again. "We were wrong. We were scared." Daniel pulled a folded sheet of paper from his pocket. "I found this in Mom's things. An email Sophia sent years ago." He unfolded it and read aloud. "Typical Emma ruining everything again. She will drag that kid down just like she always does." The room gasped. Faces turned toward Richard and Margaret, whose shame was now laid bare. Daniel's voice was steady, unwavering. "This is what you thought of us. This is what you let Sophia say what you believed. And now you come here with tears and talk of family. Family is who shows up. Family is who stays. My grandmother stayed. My mom stayed. Jacob stayed. You did not." The silence after his words was absolute. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably. A cousin shook his head in disgust. Clara leaned on her cane, her eyes blazing. Richard's shoulders sagged, his face pale. Margaret buried her face in her hands. For once, they had no defense. And in that moment, I realized the power had shifted. They could no longer erase me. They could no longer control the narrative. The truth was out in the open, undeniable. They had come to claim a grandson, but what they received was judgment. Judgment not from me alone, but from the family and community who finally saw the truth. The dinner that night turned into something larger than I could have imagined. What began as a family meal became a reckoning, a courtroom without walls with neighbors and cousins as the jury. The clatter of forks and the smell of roasted chicken lingered in the air, but no one was eating anymore. All eyes were on Richard and Margaret, their shame laid bare under the weight of Daniel's words. Daniel stood tall, his hospital ID badge still clipped to his scrubs, the stethoscope around his neck like a seal of authority. He spoke not with anger, but with clarity, his voice cutting through the silence. For 25 years, you chose silence over love, pride over compassion, reputation over your own daughter. You thought you could erase her, but look at her now. She raised me without your help, without your blessing, and she raised me into the man I am today. Every word hit like a hammer. Margaret wept openly, her shoulders shaking, but Richard sat stiff, his jaw clenched his pride, still battling even as his power crumbled. Neighbors shifted in their chairs, some whispering, others shaking their heads. One older woman, Mrs. Harris from down the street, finally spoke. "I remember that winter," she said quietly. "We all wondered why Emma was gone, why she never came around. You let us believe lies, Richard. You let us think she had run off reckless when in truth you had cast her out." Her words carried the weight of years, and murmurs rippled around the table. Another cousin Michael spoke next. "I was told Emma had disgraced the family. That is what you said at reunions. But now I see the truth. You disgraced yourselves." Each voice was another stone on the scale, tipping it further against them. I sat at the table, my hands trembling, my heart pounding, but for once I did not have to defend myself alone. The community I had once thought indifferent now saw clearly. Daniel's steady voice had opened their eyes. He turned to Sophia's email again, reading each cruel word aloud. Typical Emma. Always a mistake. Dragging everyone down. The paper shook slightly in his hand, but his eyes were firm. "This is who you chose to believe. This is the sister you defended while you erased my mother." Richard's face reddened, his composure cracking. "Enough," he barked. "This is not for everyone to hear. This is family business." Daniel's reply was swift. "Family business." He repeated, his tone sharp. "Family business is when you protect each other, when you lift each other up." This was cruelty. This was abandonment, and tonight everyone will hear it because you spent years hiding it. The room went still again, the only sound the ticking of Clara's old clock on the wall. Jacob leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Emma built this life without you. She worked double shifts, studied at night, raised Daniel with the help of Clara. You had no part in it. You forfeited the right to call yourselves family the moment you slammed that door." Clara's cane tapped the floor as she spoke, her voice raspy but strong. "I told you years ago that family is who stays. Well, we stayed. You did not." Her words were final, like the strike of a gavel. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came. Margaret reached across the table, her hand trembling as if to touch mine. "Emma, please," she whispered. "Please forgive us." My throat tightened, memories flooding back, the cold night air, the sting of the slap, the sound of the door closing behind me. I took a deep breath, my voice steady. "Forgiveness is not a gift I owe you. It is something you earn, and I have seen nothing tonight that shows you understand what you did. Daniel is my son, my family, and you will not use him to wash away your sins." Gasps rippled around the table. Margaret collapsed into sobs, her head in her hands. Richard pushed his chair back, his pride wounded, his authority broken. He stood slowly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the truth. Without another word, he walked toward the door, Margaret stumbling after him. The room stayed silent until the sound of their car faded down the road. Then voices erupted, neighbors offering comfort, cousins praising Daniel's courage. Clara reaching for my hand with tears shining in her eyes. "You did it," she whispered. You faced them. No, I said softly, glancing at Daniel. We did it. The confrontation was no longer just between me and my parents. It had become a public reckoning, a moment where the truth was spoken aloud and witnessed by the very people my father had once wanted to impress. The man who had cared so deeply for reputation had lost it all in one evening, not because of gossip or rumor, but because his own actions had finally been revealed. As I looked around the table at the faces of those who had heard every word I knew, there was no going back. The truth was out. The power had shifted. And for the first time in decades, I felt free. The fallout from that dinner spread through Dayton faster than I could have imagined. In small towns, news travels with the wind, and when it carries the scent of scandal, it finds its way into every corner. By the next Sunday, whispers filled the pews at church. Richard had spent years cultivating his image as a man of honor, a pillar of discipline, but now people looked at him differently. I heard later from neighbors that men he once golfed with crossed the street to avoid him, that women who used to praise Margaret's devotion now shook their heads in quiet disapproval. The story of how they had cast me out pregnant and alone was no longer my private pain. It was common knowledge laid bare by Daniel's steady voice. My father's pride had always been his armor, but now it was cracked beyond repair. He stopped attending the men's breakfasts at church. He avoided eye contact in the grocery store. His name, once spoken with respect, became the subject of hushed conversations and pitying glances. For a man who valued reputation above all else, it was a kind of death. Margaret fared little better. Though some sympathized with her tears at the dinner table, most could not overlook her silence in the years that mattered most. Friends she had once gossiped with over coffee no longer invited her. At the market, she would reach for produce while whispers followed her down the aisle. She became a shadow of herself, slipping into stores at odd hours, clutching her purse as if it could shield her from judgment. Sophia, always the golden child, suffered consequences of her own. Word of the cruel email Daniel had read aloud spread quickly. Her colleagues at the law firm heard about it, and though no official action was taken, her reputation suffered. Clients began to request other associates. Her longtime boyfriend, embarrassed by the exposure of her disdain for family, broke off their relationship. For someone who thrived on being admired, the sudden chill of disapproval was devastating. Clara, on the other hand, walked through town with her head high. Neighbors stopped her to say they admired her strength, that they had not known the truth of what she had done for me and for Daniel. She would shrug modestly, but I could see the pride in her eyes. For years, she had been dismissed by Richard as too soft, but now everyone saw that her softness was strength, the kind that endures when pride crumbles. Daniel continued his residency at Hopkins, his story only gaining more attention. The Gazette ran a follow-up piece this time, including mention of his grandmother and mother who had supported him. At work, patients whispered his name with gratitude. Young students looked to him as inspiration. He carried himself with humility, but I knew the fire of that dinner still burned in him. He had spoken his truth, defended me in front of those who had tried to erase us, and the world had listened. For me, the aftermath was complicated. On the one hand, I felt a release I had never known before. The burden of silence, the years of hiding my shame, had lifted. People knew the truth, and it was not me who bore disgrace. But the scars did not vanish overnight. Some nights, I still woke with the echo of Richard's voice in my head, still felt the sting of his hand on my cheek. Healing, I realized, is not a single moment, but a long road, one step at a time. One afternoon, months after the dinner, Margaret appeared at Clara's doorstep. Her eyes were swollen, her face lined with exhaustion. She begged for forgiveness, her hands clutching at mine. "Emma, please, I was weak. I should have defended you. I should have protected you." I wanted to believe her. Some part of me still longed for a mother's embrace, still ached for the love I had been denied. But Clara stood firm beside me, her voice clear. "Emma owes you nothing. Forgiveness is not a right. It is a gift, and you have not earned it." Margaret wept, collapsing onto the porch steps, but I did not waver. I told her quietly, "I will not hate you, but I cannot welcome you back. You chose silence when I needed you most. That choice has consequences." She left that day, her figure small against the horizon, and I felt both sorrow and strength. Richard never came again. Pride would not allow it. He retreated deeper into his shell, his presence in the community shrinking until he was little more than a bitter man with a tarnished name. Sophia tried once to call her voice tight with frustration. "You ruined everything," she accused. I let her words wash over me and then hung up. I had spent too many years carrying their weight. I would not do it anymore. Life in our house carried on steady and full. Jacob's construction business grew. Clara's laughter filled the kitchen. Daniel called often with updates from the hospital. Each call reminded me that despite everything, despite the scars, we had built something real, something strong. The fallout had not destroyed us. It had destroyed them. And in that reversal lay a justice I had once thought impossible. In the months that followed, I felt an unfamiliar peace settle into the corners of my life. It did not arrive all at once, but crept in gradually like the first warmth of spring after a brutal winter. The nights grew quieter without the echo of my father's rage in my head. The mornings brighter as I poured coffee in Clara's kitchen and watched sunlight spread across the faded linoleum. For the first time in decades, I was not bracing for another blow from the past. Daniel's residency consumed him long shifts at Hopkins that stretched from dawn until well past midnight, but he called whenever he could. His voice was tired, yet alive with purpose. He would tell me about a surgery that tested him about a patient who clutched his hand in gratitude about the exhaustion that made him question everything and the triumph that kept him going. Each story reminded me why I had fought so hard, why I had endured humiliation and exile to bring him into the world. He was proof that love could grow even in poisoned soil. Jacob's business thrived as well. His construction company landed contracts for schools and small office buildings around Dayton. He came home with dust in his hair and calluses on his hands, but always with a smile that softened the years of hardness in my own heart. We built a home together that was not grand, but was filled with warmth, a place where Daniel's medical textbooks mingled with Clara's knitting and my own nursing journals. I had risen in my career too, working my way from part-time shifts to a respected position as a nurse manager. It was not easy balancing work with family and the shadows of old wounds, but every challenge reinforced the truth I had learned in Clara's house. Strength comes from showing up day after day, even when the world tries to erase you. Clara grew frailer as time passed, her once quick steps slowing, her hands trembling when she lifted her teacup. Yet her spirit never dimmed. She would sit on the porch wrapped in a shawl, telling Daniel stories of our family's history. She spoke of ancestors who had crossed oceans, who had endured wars and poverty, and she reminded him that resilience ran in our blood, even if kindness had skipped a generation. At 82, Clara passed away in her sleep, the quilt she had stitched over decades tucked around her shoulders. We buried her beneath the oak tree. She loved the one that shaded the garden she had tended every summer. The loss cut deep, but it was softened by gratitude. She had given me more than shelter. She had given me a blueprint for love that endures. In her will, she left the brick house to me, a gesture that felt like both a gift and a responsibility. Standing on the porch after the funeral, Daniel beside me in his dark suit and Jacob's arm around my waist, I whispered a promise to her spirit. I will keep this place alive. It will always be a home. The years after Clara's passing were not without challenges, but they were ours to meet together. Daniel advanced through his residency, his name appearing in medical journals, his mentors praising his precision and compassion. Patients wrote letters that we kept in a shoebox, notes that spoke of lives saved and hope restored. Each letter was a balm on the scars my parents had left. Jacob expanded his company hiring crews, mentoring young builders, creating a reputation for integrity that spread through the region. At church and in town, people began to associate the Caldwell name not with Richard's pride or Margaret's silence, but with the family we had built. For me, the greatest healing came not from success, but from the small moments. Sitting at the dinner table with Jacob and Daniel, laughter filling the room. Watching Daniel teach Jacob how to use a new phone app, their voices overlapping with patience and teasing. Tending Clara's roses in the garden, my hands in the soil feeling her presence in every bloom. One summer evening, Daniel sat with me on the porch, the cicadas singing the air thick with the scent of honeysuckle. He looked out across the yard, the same yard where I had once clutched my duffel bag in fear, and said quietly, "Mom, you gave me everything." I shook my head. "No, Daniel, I only gave you life. You made it into something extraordinary." He turned to me, his eyes shining. "You gave me courage. You walked away from people who were supposed to love you and built something better. Every patient I save, every life I touch is because you showed me what resilience looks like." Tears filled my eyes, not of sorrow, but of release. In that moment, I understood that the story of my life was no longer defined by the night I was slapped and cast out. It was defined by the nights I stayed, by the mornings I rose, by the choices I made to love fiercely despite the absence of it. The past never fully disappears. Sometimes I still see Richard's face in my dreams, still hear Sophia's cutting laughter, but those memories no longer control me. They are chapters closed, lessons learned. The open pages belong to me, to Jacob, to Daniel. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the yard in gold, I felt a quiet certainty. I had been erased once, but I had rewritten the story in ink no one could wash away. The final scene of this chapter of my life is simple yet profound. Daniel in his scrubs, Jacob in his work boots, me with soil under my fingernails from Clara's roses, sitting together on that porch. A family forged not by approval or reputation, but by endurance and love. I leaned close to Daniel and whispered words that had lived in my heart for years. They erased me once, but I built my own story. He nodded, his hand warm over mine, and together we watched the stars emerge, each one a reminder that light always returns after darkness. And to those who listen to this story, I ask, have you ever been erased by your own family? Have you ever had to rebuild from the ashes of rejection? If so, share it below because your story matters too. Thank you for staying with me through this story. It was not an easy one to tell, and I imagine for many of you listening, it was not an easy one to hear. Family can be the source of our deepest joy, but also of our deepest wounds. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most are the ones who push us out, silence us, or try to erase us. And yet what I have learned is that being cast aside is not the end of the story. It can be the beginning of a new one written on our own terms. If you have ever been through something similar, if you have been rejected, humiliated, or made to feel like you did not belong, I want you to know you are not alone. Your pain is real. Your story matters, and there is strength in speaking it out loud. When we share these experiences, we remind each other that survival is possible, that rebuilding is possible, and that love can be found in the most unexpected places. I would love to hear your story. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? Have you faced a moment when your own family turned their back on you? Did you find healing in new relationships in chosen family in the quiet strength of simply carrying on? Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you do not miss future stories. Every week I share true-to-life dramas of betrayal, survival, and redemption stories that remind us we are stronger than the pain we carry. And finally, I ask you to think about this family is not always defined by blood. Sometimes it is defined by who shows up, who stays, who fights for you when the world turns away. Hold on to those people, cherish them, because in the end, they are the ones who make us whole.